Hello, everybody. How are you? I have John coming on. There he is. Welcome to our lunchtime webinar at the California Preservation Foundation Conference. We're glad to see you again. We have a poll that's up on the page right now that you can go ahead and answer that our panelists have created to help give them the context. As you know, if you've been listening to well, I'm Chris Madrid French. I forgot the introduction. John, I'm Development Director, and John Haber is?
I am the Field Services Director.
And he's our Zoom producer for today.
And
yeah.
Oh, I thought you were the Zoom producer.
Not this one, no.
Oh, okay.
I see Catherine popped on. So what I'd like to do before we get started, Catherine, I'd just like to let everybody know that you can use the chat window to communicate with us or with each other. If that chat window bothers you, you can pull it to the side. But if you want, you can go ahead and post where you're calling in from and see if any of your friends are in the room. As John mentioned, during the pre-roll, we use that Q&A box. You can post your questions early and often, and we will be answering those questions. The panel will be answering those questions towards the end of the 1 hour program. We also have closed captioning available, and you can see that at the bottom of your screen, a little CC with live transcript. Go ahead and click that if you need anything. And John and I will be in the background in the chat room and posting links, including links to our Line Upper conference app, which has bios for all of the speakers, and links to our sponsors who very generously provided the funding that makes this program free for everybody. So at this point, I'd love to welcome Christine Lazaretto. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Reframing Integrity. I'm Christine Lazaretto, Managing Principal of Historic Resources Group and currently the President of the California Preservation Foundation, and I will be acting as the moderator this afternoon. Today's session is the start of a series of conversations hosted by CPF around the concept of historic integrity. And Adrian, if you could pull up the slides. While most landmark programs consider both architecturally and culturally significant properties, integrity can be an impediment to designation, in particular for sites that are associated with women, people of color, or other underrepresented communities. I do think there has been some progress. Theme studies undertaken both here in California and beyond at the state and local levels have helped to further the narrative and broaden our thinking about history and what makes a place historic. But if we want our historic registers to be more diverse and inclusive, then there needs to be some practical and tangible guidance about the application of integrity to help us move the needle forward. And that's what we're hoping to start with all of you here today. The images on the screen illustrate the types of properties we're referring to. These are places that are not architecturally significant and certainly wouldn't be identified during a visual survey, but they're significant for an important association with a particular community or within a particular social or cultural context. Most of the examples you're seeing actually have been designated. Some are landmarks in the city of Los Angeles, and the last two have been listed in the National Register. But I would say in many cases, getting there wasn't easy. Getting property owners, decision makers, and sometimes even the community to understand the importance of a place that doesn't look traditionally historic, or connecting the idea of physicality with more intangible heritage is difficult. We talk a lot about a sense of place in preservation, but I think a lot of issues we're working through today, a rethinking or reframing of the narrative is important. We need to listen to the people whose stories are being told and understand what sense of place means within a particular community. I recently read an article arguing for a re-examination of how integrity standards are applied that noted the details of a thin limestone belt course beneath the second-story windows should not be more important than 100 years of practice. And I think that pretty succinctly summarizes this issue and highlights the essence of the discussion. The question we'd like to dive into today is, where do we go from here? And to that end, and to help us launch this important conversation, I'm very pleased to welcome today's panel. Adrian Scott Fine, Senior Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy. Catherine Fleming Bruce, the author of The Sustainers, Being, Building, and Doing Good Through Activism in the Sacred Spaces of Civil Rights, Human Rights, and Social Movements, and CEO of Tinovsa Global Commons, and Dr. Ray Rast, Associate Professor of History at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, a board member for Latinos in Heritage Conservation and the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, and a member of the Spokane Historic Landmarks Commission. Welcome and thank you to all of the panelists for being here today. And before we get into the discussion, I was going to ask John to share the poll results with us. We wanted to ask all of you sort of, are you grappling with the same issue and how do you see this moving forward? Do we need some alternative integrity standards for sites that are not architecturally significant? So just a quick look at the poll this afternoon is that the answer to both of these questions seems to be yes, which I think maybe isn't a surprise at a California Preservation Foundation event, but it's really helpful to us to help us frame the discussion today. So thank you to all of you for participating in the poll. And with that, please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I guess let's just dive right in. John, I think you can take the poll down, and if you want to enlarge us so that everyone can see us. We're not going to have any more slides, I don't think, this afternoon. So good afternoon to all of you. You were each invited to be part of the panel because you have a viewpoint and or experience in grappling with this issue. So just by way of introduction, I hope you could each talk a little bit about your work in this arena and some general thoughts from your perspective. And maybe Catherine, if we could start with you.
Sure, thanks so much. I'm so glad to be here and have this opportunity to discuss how we can make sure that there's more diversity in these sites, definitely by looking at what the guidelines are, the integrity guidelines. And I'm thinking of a couple of stories. One, because the work that I did on civil rights and human rights sites focused on a variety of different kinds of sites. So we looked at a bus station, a house, school, churches, a variety of these sites. And one thing that happens is some of the sites are going to have more integrity because they have a community of people around them that provide for its sustenance. So an example of that is the church, so if there's like the 16th Street Church in Birmingham. So since that has had a consistent community of people paying for the building, it's more likely to have integrity than someone's home, home of a civil rights legend, or some other kind of facility that just has one or two people connected to it. So I think that it's important in order to have a broad range of different types of buildings that help tell the complete story. Otherwise, not only are you going to not have the diversity, but the buildings that you do have that are diverse may end up being, something like a church or a larger, a place that has a larger funding base, and the homes of civil rights leaders and human rights leaders and other individuals may fall off the map.
Yeah, that's a great point, and thank you for that, and welcome. Adrian, maybe if you want to go next.
Sure, thanks, Christine. Agree with everything that Catherine said. I think we're probably all going to agree on a lot of things that we share today. I've been working in preservation in the nonprofit sector pretty much my entire career, starting in the early 90s, both in the Midwest, the East Coast on a national perspective, and now on the West Coast for the LA Conservancy. And this issue of integrity has been discussed, debated from the very beginning that I've been working in preservation. So, and we talk about it a lot. We have conversations, and now it's time to let's do something, figure this out. And I think there is a moment now in terms of talking about inclusivity and opening the doors till we tell a broader story, that we have a moment here that we should take advantage of and move this forward. I guess my thoughts on this are, and I have many, but a couple of things are, one, around the word itself, integrity. that's a problem, and that we tell a community and people that care about a place that your place does not have integrity, and therefore is not eligible. And that's not where people come from. I mean, we need to meet people where they are in terms of what they care about in their communities. And when we prescribe this very kind of it either is or isn't, or black-white kind of prescriptive approach to things, it limits, it's a barrier, it restricts us from being broad and inclusive and telling stories about Black spaces, LGBTQ, queer spaces, women's spaces, Latinx spaces, all the places that typically are less about the physical materiality of what the building looks like and how it was designed, and more about what happened and who was associated with it. And that's where the integrity, you know, the word and how it has been applied, I think really misses the point in many ways, because it's mostly tied to architecture and materiality rather than about the stories and the people and the things that took place in those buildings, even though they may have changed over time.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. And Dr. Rast, a few words of introduction from you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Christine, Adrian, and Catherine. I think I could listen to you for much more than the 50 minutes we have left. But I would say, by way of introduction, that so I'm history faculty as my day job, but I've been doing historic preservation for about 20 years, mostly with the National Park Service. My introduction to integrity and the issues surrounding integrity came about 10 years ago. From 2009 to 2012, I was teaching at Cal State Fullerton, and I and my students worked with the National Park Service on the Cesar Chavez Special Resource Study, which was mandated by Congress. We looked at more than 100 sites and properties associated with the life and leadership of Chavez and the history of the farm worker movement, trying to identify sites that we thought might be eligible for National Register nomination or listing, National Historic Landmark designation, or even inclusion in the National Park System as units. And you know, by and large, the sites and properties we were looking at had integrity issues. Around the same time, 2010 to 2012, primarily, I was serving on the planning committee of the National Park System Advisory Board. And that committee, not a standing committee, but that committee came together to work on kind of a blueprint for a new master plan for the National Park System. And that was in anticipation of the centennial of the Park Service, 2015. We're kind of looking forward to that. And my role on that committee, I really kind of grabbed onto integrity as the topic, the issue that I wanted to learn more about and kind of make recommendations. So most of my work has been with and about the National Park Service, but general thoughts that I'd share are those of a historian who studied the history of preservation. So in a nutshell, from the 1850s to and through the 1960s, I think the primary impetus of historic preservation was historic preservation, not architectural preservation. So preservationists for more than a century were motivated by a desire to preserve history. I think they were, as kind of Adrian was saying, motivated by a desire to tell stories about the past, to share lessons and insights about the past at preserved places. Preservationists were not as motivated by a desire to elevate and celebrate what Ada Louise Huxtable and others have called the art of architecture. But I think that pendulum has swung, again, crudely, simply from history to architecture over the past 40 to 50 years. And this shift has made the integrity of physical features more and more important over the course of those decades. And my work has led me to conclude that the concept of integrity really can't carry all the weight that's been put on it because of these changes. So in practice, and these are kind of my bullet point critiques of integrity. In practice, the concept of integrity is ill-defined. It's measured inconsistently. It's conflated with interpretation. which I think is very problematic. It promotes ahistorical thinking and feeds into nostalgia. And ultimately, it privileges properties that are already well preserved, properties that can already sort of clear that bar. And those properties tend to be buildings with an aesthetic appeal that ends up driving gentrification. So I could go into more detail on any of those, but I've developed this critique.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think, I'm struggling a little bit with how to frame the next series of questions. I'd love to follow up with all three of you on some things you mentioned. And we have a number of questions already coming into the Q&A. But I think, obviously all three of you hit on the nexus of this problem, which is, I think, at least within the circles that we are all in, that there's a general understanding that we need to get better at this and we need to figure out how to move this forward. And we need to figure out how to have more inclusivity in the places that we designate, that we consider historic. But we're grounded in the built environment, and we are talking about places and buildings and landscapes for the most part. I'm talking above ground related resources today mostly. So I guess I just want to maybe get into that a little bit more to talk about the physicality and how you then see not necessarily separating the two, but rethinking. And I think, Ray, you touched on a couple of these in a few of the bullet points you just mentioned. But, one of the main concepts behind integrity when they were developing all these standards back in the 1960s was the idea of authenticity. And I think we probably all agree that that's important, but I wonder if you could maybe each talk a little bit about how you think about it in terms of authenticity and what that means, and then what that means in terms of how we're evaluating properties for historic significance. Maybe that's three questions in one, but like I said, sort of the idea of tying together the physical built environment and these more sort of esoteric ideas we're talking about. I don't know. I don't know who wants to touch on that one first.
Well, I'll try to be quick. I think one of the questions that we had in advance is how do we define authenticity? And I mean, that's a huge question, but I tried to boil it down to a site that has a site of property that has authenticity is a site of property that is what it purports to be, or it is what its advocates purport it to be. And to back up from that a little bit, there has to be something there, right? Something to preserve, something to interpret. And, I think there's always going to be a site, even if the structure that, might have had significance is gone. But honestly, I really want to know more about this relationship and then kind of bifurcation that I think happened in the 1960s. The little bit that I know about the relationship between integrity and authenticity, I know from people like Vince Michael. And I just haven't had the capacity to do that digging. But I really think there's an opportunity in this relationship to advance and maybe even simplify how we evaluate integrity. And I think it comes down to, is the site, and I think this is maybe originally what the intent was, is the site of property what its advocates purport it to be, right? And then integrity is how do we prove that, right? But I think there needs to be kind of more of a distinction made between those.
I would just add on to that. I think it goes back to the meeting people where they are and what they care about. And that goes to what I think Ray is talking about. And while integrity is rooted in authenticity, and Ray said this in his opening, it seems like we have just completely gone to one side of it from the physical materiality evaluation. And we haven't talked about the 7 aspects of integrity yet. But they're trotted out when people are evaluating on one side or the other whether a place has integrity and then ultimately is it eligible, that whole discussion. And you may have some setting, feeling, association, those are the more intangible aspects, but then it often again goes more towards the physical side of things in terms of this. So I think when we're talking about authenticity, it is, I think, what Ray is saying about what does this place authentically mean to the people that care about it, and that matters. And this was a recent conversation in Los Angeles around the Sister Mary Creative Studio, which is a building that's been radically altered. Everyone agrees it's been changed, but the basic form is still there. And we had a very robust debate, certainly at a city cultural heritage commission, that I think changed a lot of hearts and minds about this building, in part because the people that fortunately are still with us could share that, yes, this building was important in terms of Sister Mary created and the art movement. And they answered this question. And this is one of the things that is often brought out is, would the people associated with the place recognize it today after it's been changed? You know, we hear that all the time, and it's evaluated and people say no. You know, I don't know how they know that answer either, but they say that. And so it was really helpful when the people, the art students said, I absolutely would recognize that building. I know that building. I come to town and I point to that building and say, that's where this, you know, these things happen. And I think that was one of the turning moments in this, but we can't always have to rely on people still living to be able to answer that question. But that is one of the things that is fundamental to this piece of evaluating integrity of, like, would you recognize it or not?
And, you know, there's something else that you can recognize by being in buildings where certain things happen. You know, I think about the Majeska Simpkins building, a civil rights site in Columbia, in my city. And when people go in, they say they feel Majeska's presence. So again, that's an intangible. Certainly people who go to the Medgar Evers site would have the same kind of intangible feeling of reverence, or a mixture of feelings and emotions. And so, and the same for the Lorraine Motel. And that was a building that, despite its integrity, was about to be demolished because there hadn't been enough consensus around those feelings that people have. Because there are conflicting feelings about uncomfortable things that happen, about this assassination and all of the racial history behind it. For many years, people just wanted to put it away. And so that led to the building coming under threat. So when these buildings have this kind of integrity, fortunately, some of the material is still there. It doesn't have to all be authentic. But I think more than the physical authenticity of the building is that connection that people have, not only to the individuals there, but to your place in the civil rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, the women's movement. So you're feeling that you're a part of that river, and you can continue that work. So that's very important, I think, for people to remember when we're trying to figure out what should be saved and why.
Christine, can I add one other thing?
Yes, please.
It's probably left for another discussion, but I don't want to, I think it's related to this, and you can't really divorce it when you're talking about integrity, is the concept of period of significance. That is often, or sometimes feels very rigid and maybe artificial in terms of how it's prescribed between the start and the end. And I think it feeds into this whole issue of authenticity too, that, you know, where we sometimes as preservationists, we tell a community, well, that's not within the period of significance, so it doesn't matter. And who and how did someone determine that a period of significance, you know, doesn't matter to a community because it falls with the outside of these, you know, very prescribed, you know, boundaries in terms of a place? And that's another tool that I think sometimes we misalign in terms of the way we evaluate places and connect both integrity and the period of significance.
That's true, although I would say maybe as a little bit of a counter to that, sometimes that can be helpful, that if you can really define when is this place really important, you know, within the context of what happened there or its cultural significance, and maybe, you know, people who are arguing that it doesn't have integrity because things had happened at various points in its history, sometimes that can be used against it. But I think if you can boil down, sometimes specificity is helpful, although your point is very well taken that it can go both ways. So I think it's part of sort of this larger narrative about how we do all of this. And, as a preservation consultant, and I think there's a lot of thoughts in the chat about our role in this whole situation. But I can just say, as a person who got into consulting because I am interested in historic preservation and historic places, that it's difficult, it's hard. You're walking a line between property owners and regulators, and in California, a pretty robust regulatory environment and framework that we all have to work in. So sort of figuring out how to navigate all of this, and just, this won't surprise you, Adrian, but a lot of people, when the Sister Mary Carita nomination was coming forward, I got a lot of questions from people along the lines of, are you kidding me? This can't be where we're going in terms of historic places. And of course, all of us here today disagree with that sentiment, but just, it's putting all of these things together, I think, is hard. And so I think, the next thing I wanted to talk about, unless Ray, you had another thought about the authenticity issue.
Just, as a historian, this is what I say. One of my critiques is that the concept of integrity is ahistorical. It's this notion that we can freeze things in time, we can freeze buildings in time. And I know that's kind of the gist of preservation, but all things are always changing, no matter how much we try to preserve them. That's the insight of the historian. Everything changes over time. Maybe it's a matter of pace or perceptibility. But yeah, I'm such an advocate for this flexibility with period of significance and expanding it when that's helpful to capturing and respecting the changes.
Yeah, and so maybe along those lines, and thinking about, an ultimate goal of putting together some guidance that maybe can move the needle, as we keep saying this afternoon, and providing some guidance for regulatory agencies and local commissions. And, I think part of it is just having some narrative that people can point to, some precedent, here's some arguments that have worked in other places, so that, I think sometimes you can feel like you're starting from scratch, or that you're working on these issues alone. And so maybe you could each talk about that a little bit, where you've been fighting for some of these places that are maybe less understood. How did you move the needle? What were the arguments that were persuasive in your particular scenario that helped get some places designated or recognized?
Well, I can think of the place that I'm working on now, which is the Cyril Spann building. It's and he was a physician, a Black physician that did a lot of work in our state, was at the time that he was active, was the only Black surgeon in the state. And, therefore was on the back roads and doing a lot of work. He was also involved in the civil rights movement at that time as well. And I've heard a variety of things over the years, including, well, that building could really be knocked down. And this is from city staffers. And then later on, a few years later, after some additional work had been done on segregation sites, or sites that are connected to the history of segregation, there was kind of a body of work that had been done locally to identify these sites. When I raised some issues about this particular site, because it was not included in a National Register district that exists. So I was trying to find out if it could be included, and their conclusion was, well, no, it can't be included, but it could be a site in its own right. So we kind of went from that extreme based on the expansion of segregation and the architecture of that period. So I think one way to try to bring in this change in integrity is by doing that additional work in these particular topics and themes, because then you can add sites according to that, I added another site based on some research that was done on labor and architectural sites that were connected to the labor movement and women in the workplace and things like that. So that's what I think would give people some comfort level, especially if those are done statewide, and then people can attach to that. And then secondarily, what movements might be coming nationally.
I would just add, in terms of this question, what arguments are persuasive? I think one thing that is persuasive is when the community, stands up and is very vocal about what they care about. That does change perspectives, and that's all of our jobs, is to build those relationships, especially the communities that typically have been outside the circle of preservation. And that takes trust, and it takes a lot of time to get there. But I think of like recent examples, the Chicana Moratorium March. It took us 5 years of efforts to get that listed on the National Register, which we achieved last year, which is, it's from 1969, 70, a march route, and having lots of, brain numbing or brain damaged conversations between us at the Conservancy, our consultant, Teresa Grimes, who did, yeoman's work and sticking with us for the whole process, the state office and the National Park Service, to figure out how to make this thing work, a march route, and some buildings and places that traditionally wouldn't be eligible, but to ensure that they were included, including the Silver Dollar Cafe, which has been radically changed over time as well. But it's a contributing resource as part of the National Register listing here. And I think that moved the needle in terms of understanding both at the state as well as the National Park Service. But it was really coming from the community that said, this matters to us and we want recognition. We want our story to be honored and commemorated. And that's why National Register was really important. But I think about like, the same example with like Tokyo Florist, which is another example in Los Angeles of a building that has, it was a perfectly nice Victorian craftsman, kind of Victorian Tudor kind of building, but its real story came about in the 60s when it became a florist and it was associated with a Japanese American family. And they made these modifications to the building, subsequent layer that traditionally would have been evaluated as non-contributing, alterations to the building kind of thing. And fortunately, because the community is really strong, and I think there had been some groundwork in Los Angeles in understanding this history, but everybody came together and said, no, these things are important. Now we need to figure out interpretation, which is a whole nother piece of the discussion, that we don't lose this layer of what typically would have been, non-contributing. But it comes back to the community standing up and us reaching out to communities to say, no, I know you felt like maybe you weren't part of this tent or circle, but actually you should be, and let's figure out a way to fit you in. But that gets into the challenge of, do you have receptive voices or decision makers ultimately?
I couldn't agree with that more. That's critical, having that community engagement.
So I have a similar insight, and the case study I talk about, I'm sure there's some people listening who've heard me talk about this before, but a building known as McDonald Hall in East San Jose, historically Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission Chapel. It's a site that we identified in the context of this Chavez Special Resource Study. In the 1950s, it was Caesar's place of worship, a devout Catholic, and he received the mentorship of the priest, and then he also met community organizer Fred Ross and worked outside of this building. So its significance in the 1950s. In the 1970s, the parish was able to build a new church building and then renovated this chapel building, this former chapel building, into the parish hall. In the course of doing so, removed the bell tower, removed the stained glass windows, and then, the interior furnishings, the pews and everything, and to make it function in a different kind of way. And, you know, so similar to, you know, what Adrian and Catherine is saying, the insights and the arguments came from the community. So I was hired to prepare the National Historic Landmark nomination, and we were thinking about National Register nomination and many other things. But they were, you know, sharing with them, here's the process, and here are the arguments that we're facing, the obstacles, and so on. One of them was about, would somebody recognize the buildings, which, you know, Caesar was alive and he saw it today. And the Park Service people were saying, you know, we don't think so. And so I shared this with stakeholders, and they said, no, we'll find plenty of people who would see it today without the bell tower, without the stained glass windows. And they would say, of course, it's the same building. And we had many, you know, powerful testimony of people saying this feeling, right, of being inside of it and going back home, right, and all the good memories that flood over them.
Exactly.
So that was really powerful. And then with these features in particular, character defining features, which as a historian, I'm not too familiar with that language. I mean, I know I am familiar with the language, I don't use it. But again, sharing it with the community, and they said, well, the character of this building, it's not about the bell tower, it's not about the stained glass windows. The character of the building, when it was important and why it's still important to us today, is that it was just a humble building that served this community. And in fact, when it was opened in the 1950s, and it was actually a building built in the 19-teens and moved to East San Jose. But at the time, that was the only gathering space that, this is working class Mexican immigrant, Mexican American Catholics and others, but that was the only place they could gather and discuss community issues and strategize for advocacy and so on. There was an elementary school, and the school district wouldn't allow them to hold meetings there. So otherwise, it's just they're humble, small homes, right? So the character of the building was defined for them by 4 walls and a roof. And so we said, it doesn't have the bell tower, we know that. It doesn't have the stained glass windows, we know that. But those weren't the reasons it was significant. It was significant because it was a gathering space, right? And so we made that case, and I want to think that contributed to the success of that nomination.
Now, somebody put in the chat, integrity of feelings. I like that. That's very much what we're talking about.
Yes, definitely. And there are a ton of questions coming in. And so I'm not, I guess maybe I'll maybe frame one more for all of you, and then maybe we can go to the very robust chat and Q&A box and get some questions out from the audience. I think I just maybe want to follow up, just in keeping in mind our goal to try to produce something, and certainly not today, but like I mentioned at the beginning, we want to have a series of conversations. We need to invite some other perspectives to the table to talk about this and to push us in our own thinking. So we're certainly planning to do that over the coming months. But just like I said, to keep that in mind, maybe, and Adrian, you touched on this in the theme studies, and I think all of you have touched on this work you're doing. You know, if you could point us towards some work in this arena, Adrian, when you and I were talking the other day, you mentioned the LGBTQ context statement for San Francisco has some really good and interesting thoughts about how to apply integrity to potential resources associated with that context. So, so maybe just giving us a little bit more precedent and a little bit more guidance for everybody listening that we can all dive into when we leave here today would be great.
Sure, I can maybe start since you queued me up.
Yes.
I think there are some models out there, or I think some really good thinking that we need in California. Our goal is to move the needle. We move beyond having the same conversation that we've all been having for 20 plus years, and let's see what this leads to, whether it's guidance or interpretation or something that helps us all do this better and more inclusive. But I think there are examples like, the LGBTQ historic context that Shane Watson and Donna Graves, who maybe one or both are on the call with us today, they did some really good thinking about integrity, and it's looking at the 7 aspects, and it's kind of saying, well, not all of these are equally important. So why do we treat it that way, especially around a culturally significant place? And there's been others, certainly Ray, you mentioned Vince Michael, who has been, been talking about this as well. And I've learned a lot from him as well in terms of this, this idea of a graduated, I think he had talked about like a, A through F, maybe we grade places in terms of, where they fall on the integrity scale. And instead of it just being this kind of pass or fail kind of approach, maybe that's a way to look at this. But it also goes back to ultimately the decision makers. So it's our, preservation commissioners, it's the state offices, it's the Park Service that are ultimately making these decisions. So we need to like filter some guidance up to them, but also thinking about, how this is happening at the local level. And I would just end on some thoughts here. Los Angeles and a number of other cities across the country, in their preservation ordinance, they're silent on integrity, which is kind of progressive, whether they were intending to be or not. But LA doesn't have it in its ordinance. Having said that, it's often trotted out as part of the evaluation process. And then we as advocates remind and say, well, that's not, integral to the decision making. And sometimes it's considered, sometimes it's not. But, it's thinking about how decisions are being made and what they're relying those decisions on. So whatever we develop needs to, filter into lots of different decision makers at the local, state, national level.
Well, I'll just have to throw up my friend Jeremy Wells, who has been talking about this for some time and also giving us examples of some of the research that has been done. So some of the people that he talked about, Kate Clark, who did a work in 2019 in the Historic Environmental Policy and Practice Review Journal. So shared a number of pieces along those lines. So I think those who are looking for models will, perhaps we need a common place to put these models of different ways to change our local guidelines. And that would be a place for our local folks to have a look at, who are the ones making the preservation decisions, those people who are going to be on the national level as well, and federal level. They would have a place that they could look at these models and try to move the needle in that direction. But I think that would be a good place to start, is finding a place that we could put those in that'd be accessible to everyone.
So a few that I'd mention, Ned Kaufman's work, his book, Place, Race, and Story is foundational. John Sprinkle's book, Crafting Preservation Criteria, also the chapter on integrity, and it's a great book overall. But if you can bear with me for a couple of minutes, this other one, it's older. I mentioned it to Trudy Sandmeyer when I was kind of preparing for this roundtable. Barbara Little, in 1997, so it's 25 years old, but an article on how the Park Service, the National Register, approach archaeology. So let me back up from that for a second, because we're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure I say these things. One of my basic proposals would be, for moving forward, would be to define distinct tracks or channels in which integrity is evaluated, tied to the areas of significance. So architectural significance as a certain kind of approach to integrity, history, culture, archaeology. Another proposal would be to give more weight to interpretive potential when we're evaluating integrity. Can we say some level of interpretive potential is the benchmark that a site has to clear? And that's going to be really fluid. It's going to depend on the capacity of the interpreters, who might propose an interpretive plan. But in this article, 1997, Barbara Little's talking about archaeological sites, National Register properties that are eligible under criterion D. She said, to quote, "For these properties, integrity is based upon the property's potential to yield specific data that addresses important research questions." It's not about you think about the integrity of archaeological sites, it's doing the work. I don't know if destroys is too strong a word, but it certainly diminishes the integrity of those artifacts that are then removed from the context to be studied.
Mhm.
So she's looking at and the evaluation is looking at the potential, to provide specific data that addresses important research questions. So I would think for sites that have historical significance, something like integrity is based upon the property's potential to support historical interpretation or enhance historical understanding. Integrity evaluations for historically significant sites, if we cannot base that on their architectural features, their character defining features, their bell towers and stained glass windows or absence thereof, but on the potential for historical interpretation, education, teaching and learning, understanding, right? Those kinds of things.
So then can I just ask a quick follow-up to that? And I'm sorry if you had more and I interrupted you, but then just in terms of thinking about, our local commissions and local, preservation staff planners, then in terms of those character defining features, when someone comes in with a project in the future, those would also be the things then that should be taken into consideration when you're thinking about making future changes, right? So really what we're talking about, or I guess I'm asking, is a sea change in how we think about the physicality of a place overall, both how it is now, how it conveys what it was historically, and then what's appropriate to do with it moving forward.
Well, I'm going to jump on a comment that I saw in the chat where someone asked, does the community care? And I think that kind of goes back to what Adrian was saying about, and what I was saying about community and that feeling that people have. But most of the time, the perspective that community people have is that there are certain people who are experts, within our community and elsewhere. And so we're just going to defer everything to that and not really get engaged in the questions of preservation and what kind of things that we want, unless there's a particular community of people who, this really resonates with and we want to get them engaged. So I think we need to have a conversation about integrity that may be based around a set of various projects that will bring the community in so that they can start helping to tee up where we want to see these changes made in the guidelines. So if they're seeing that a lot of things are being preserved in the community, 100% of these things, only 20% are African-American, only 6 or 7% are LGBT, only 2% are Native American or Hispanic American. So if people are seeing that and they're saying, okay, I want to have more, then we can draw them into a conversation about, okay, these are the barriers and we need your comment so that the people who are putting together a new set of guidelines will have your input and have your say.
Christine, I'd just say quickly that I know how complicated an issue this is. And there have been many times when I've offered a critique of integrity and the response has been, well, if we can't get rid of integrity entirely, it's baked into the law. Some work that's being done, I didn't mention Sarah Bronin, I think participated this morning, right? So she's working on the sort of the post listing, importance of integrity and holding property owners accountable and devising what's appropriate in terms of modifications and so on. So I think in a nutshell, my wish would be that significance gets the bulk of the weight before the preservation decision, the designation, the listing decision, and then integrity gets the bulk of the weight after, right? So it's still a valuable tool in the toolkit, but I think it's much more, I think we'll see many of the changes that we want to see in the preservation movement if we are much more flexible with integrity before the listing decision, and then use it as it should be used after the designation decision, if that makes sense.
It does. And actually there was a question, the first question in the Q&A is about the sequence of applying integrity. So you actually already hit on that. Their question was that according to the Park Service guidance in the National Register Bulletin 15, it says you have a two-part inquiry. The first is it significant? The second is, if it is, then therefore does it retain enough integrity to convey its significance. And I think the suggestion is, in some places that's reversed, that you're looking at the physicality first and then you figure out the significance later. But I think your point is exactly that we shouldn't be doing that. We should be thinking about why a place is important and then figure out the physical aspects of that post designation, as you say. So I think that's an interesting point and sort of dovetails, I guess, directly with us maybe going into some audience questions so we don't run out of time. Before we do, I just want to mention quickly to everyone, again, that we're planning this to be a series of ongoing conversations. We'd like to continue to stay in touch with you. So hopefully John has already and can again post in the chat an email box that we've set up at CPF specific to this issue so that you can let us know if you want to participate in future workshops, but also your own case studies and struggles in your communities where you've grappled with this issue. I think someone also made a point in the chat about there's a lot of information out there and kind of getting it to the forefront and getting it into sort of a more central place that we can all look at will be helpful. So we're hoping to do that with this effort. So so the email address will be in the chat box, although you can certainly always reach any of us in all the spaces where we live, but we wanted to have one sort of gathering place for all those questions. So so thank you again to our panelists. We could talk about this obviously for 50 years and probably still have questions. So I appreciate you all diving in the short time we have today. So Chris French, maybe I'll toss it over to you to start some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I'm going to hand it to John, but before I do, Ray, there was a request if you could post in the chat the names of the authors and the books that you had referenced, and then John is going to take the first question.
Before I go to the first question, just to verbalize that email, because things are getting buried in the chat room, which is a great thing. I mean, we're really excited that there's so much conversation on this topic, and to remind our speakers and panelists and our audience, I believe you can save the chat. I think we've enabled that. So if you right click on the ellipsis symbol and click save chat, you can save all this wonderful conversation to look at later. If that doesn't work, you can just control all, select all, and save that chat for yourself for your own study later. I wanted to move on to a question. Christine addressed our top requested question about the sequence moving from significance to integrity. So I think that's been addressed. So I wanted to move from that to sort of integrity being defined as something other than the physical qualities. So Chuck was asking, couldn't integrity, the existing integrity framework, be rethought of in a non-physical manner? And to follow on that, I'm going to add a second question from Shafe, which is saying, if we were to do that with integrity, think of it in non-physical matters, what would be your 8th aspect of integrity?
I think that's an Adrian question, right? He had the 7 points.
Don't do that to me, Catherine. It's a great question, but I'm not, maybe there's an 8th, but I also think it's rethinking the 7 that we have now in terms of the way they're weighted. They're all equally kind of evaluated. And that isn't fair when you're looking at a culturally significant place. And so it's a matter of like, well, it meets only 3 of the 7, and therefore the majority it fails on, and that's again the way it's interpreted. So I think it goes back to the way that we analyze and understand these aspects of integrity. And I don't know if we need an 8th, but it may just be rethinking about how we've even been interpreting the 7 that we have now.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm going to move to the next one because we are going to run out of time. I wanted to pose a question from Lena. She says, how would you recommend a landmark applicant engage with the community and provide evidence in support of significance for a structure with no architectural integrity? In other words, what would be considered sufficient in terms of community input? And what's the threshold and the validity of the community input? I see Catherine shaking her head. I just want to say that a lot of this, we've been talking about a lot of these things for a really long time, and and kept getting dismissed. So this has been such a refreshing conversation. So how would you recommend that a landmark applicant engage with the community and provide this evidence in support of significance? Catherine, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start with the oral histories, just gathering those stories, I think, and having them triangulated if you need to, but having those stories that people are already emotionally tied to will draw them into the whole discussion. So you want that to be part of your argument, but you also want to have them there to help push that argument forward. And I'm also going to ask, in this discussion about how we make these changes, are we talking about making them from the absolute top, which is at the federal and the agencies that are there? Are we talking about trying to do this from the bottom and have it push up? What do people think is the most effective way to make that change?
Can I just also add to that question, and the first part of Catherine's response is also that our understanding that some communities don't think that preservation cares about them, or there's a place for them within our world. And I will say, when we worked around, we are working around LGBTQ queer spaces, that was a revelation for me, even being part of the community. But people that we were engaging and talking with, they said, this matters, that this nightclub, it matters to me, but this is something that would be worthy of designation, because they just assumed that it wasn't part of our world. And so I think it's also understanding that people think that they're not part of preservation, or capital P preservation. So it's incumbent upon us to, kind of break down that barrier as well in this larger conversation.
Exactly.
So I think Catherine posed a question that I think we might want to, because it does appear in the list of questions here. And the question is about, should this effort come from the bottom up or the top down? How do we change the integrity standards, and what is the process? Will it be grassroots, or will it be an institutional top down thing?
I think it has to be both. And I always try to be conscious, and I try to say this at the beginning, that most of my work has been focusing on the National Park Service and at the level of the National Historic Landmarks Program. I do find it important to explain to people who are interested in this that any new unit of the National Park System that's significant for history or culture has to meet NHL program integrity and significance standards, right? So if we want to think about diversifying our national park system, 400 plus units, we have to look at the National Historic Landmarks Program. And then the relationship between the NHL and the National Register Program, I think, is also something that's been looked at, and hopefully will again in the near-term future. But I think that the Park Service is in such a position to provide leadership. We have to hold it accountable as an agency. But then again, at the same time, as a member of my own city's Landmarks Commission, I see how we look at integrity, and I'm pleased by the flexibility that we have when we're talking to each other and using common sense.
Thanks, Ray. I have a question from Joseph. I pulled it from the Q&A. He says, our building initially was a flat roof, which started leaking, and we all know about that. And then they had to put some sheets on top. I imagine he means more roofing material. Does that take away its integrity? Adrian, what do you think?
It depends.
Good answer.
I need more information in terms of that.
But think of some examples, right? It's like maybe a Neutra building where they had to re-roof it, the VDL, maybe.
It goes back to a little bit of what Ray was saying earlier on. Buildings change. People, inhabitants change, and that's part of the layering on places. And it's part of our job is to evaluate, what is important to that story or the significance of a place. And maybe an alteration like that isn't important at all, and it could be reversed, but maybe it is. But that's where the evaluation needs to come in, around the significance first, more than integrity as being the leading factor.
And I think just sort of a related thing that we haven't touched on today is thinking about integrity in relationship to modern resources and that question of authenticity and materiality. And that's a whole nother side of this that we need to grapple with as well. So it is very unfortunately 1 o'clock. So I just wanted to officially thank our panel again. Thank you all so much for being here and for starting this really lively and excellent conversation. And thanks to everyone in the audience. I don't know, John and Chris, you have more experience with this, but I don't think I've been on a panel with more dialogue in the chat box than this one. So it's been really great. So
This is the winner.
I think
Okay.
this just set a CPF record.
I think we broke the
record.
records. This has
So-
been wonderful. Thanks, Christine, and thanks everybody for joining. John's going to be posting a link in the chat where it's a survey, and we appreciate your input where you can tell us what you thought of our program today and also of the conference. And we hope that we can see you at the next session, which is coming up very soon. And don't forget, we also have another free public event starting tonight at 5:30 p.m. Pacific, Neon Noir, featuring our special guest, Chris Nichols of LA Magazine, Corey Siegel from the Museum of Neon Art in Glendale, and John, I might need help with the names, Al Barna and Randall and Homan of San Francisco Neon. They'll be joining us tonight at 5:30 for a free webinar. You can see us tonight.
And a
So-
reminder, the same link that you used for this session will apply to the Neon program. So you can just copy and paste this link and use it tonight. So you don't even need to re-register.
And you can bring your cocktails too. It'd be happy hour
Yeah.
somewhere.
Can I ask you two one more technical question? In addition to saving the chat, is there a way to save the questions as well so we can use these moving forward?
We have them saved.
Great.
So what I could do is email them or make them available. You know what I could do is make it available on the web app for this session. So
That's a great idea.
we'll link
Mhm.
to it after this session, and then people can go back and review, because there's a lot of really interesting comments in the questions as well that we weren't able to really dig into. So we'll do that for the chat and the questions.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Are
all.
you ready to log
Thank
out,
you.
John?
Yes, we will make the
Thanks, everyone.
recording available on YouTube, hopefully by tomorrow. So check out our YouTube channel, and thank you all to our panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Christine.